we invited Hasan Bakhshi, and we were happy that he accepted to come here. He works in NESTA. NESTA, this is England, and this, I don't know if this stands anymore for the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. Initially, this was the acronym or something like that. So
that's right. Thank you, Vicky. Yeah, we used to stand for the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. We're now just NESTA. I think partly because of the confusion that there is actually between the National Endowment for Arts in the US, and actually we're very different to what they do. But I mean, just by way of a word or two of what the background for NESTA, because I noticed over lunch that some people are not familiar with our work. Just to very briefly say, we're an NGO based in London. We work to support innovation. We work in a really broad range of areas of innovation. It's fair to say, though, that for the next 2, 3, 4 years at least, most, if not all, of our work is going to be concerned in one way or the other around the barriers to social application of new technologies, of digital technologies. So it's certainly one of my interest in technology, my background in the economics of technological progress is what brought me to NESTA. So in one way or the other, a lot of what we do is around technology. The other thing just to briefly mention is that we're an endowment. So our funding model is that we invest a lottery endowment. It's about £350 million endowment. And the investment returns that we make on that endowment funds our work. We therefore both commission research. We have a fairly active program wing which designs programs where we issue grants to work with organizations on innovation, but we also sort of do research as well. So I guess the way to think about us is as an experimental development agency that works in a very broad range of areas. Now, given what I've just said, it's not surprising that we spend an awful lot of time thinking about innovation. And yet, 7 years of being at NESTA, it's pretty sobering for me to think that despite decades of sustained criticism of science and technology-driven understandings of innovation, it's still the case that the vast majority of government innovation funding is channeled through basic research funding for science, public R&D programs, and R&D subsidies and tax breaks. Education policy is usually viewed by governments as only supporting innovation insofar as it privileges the teaching of STEM subjects, that's science, technology, engineering and mathematics. And the Frascati manual, the Bible for R&D policymakers in the OECD countries, which many of you all know, defines research and experimental development as follows. Creative work undertaken on a systematic basis in order to increase the stock of knowledge, including knowledge of man, culture and society, and the use of knowledge to devise new applications. Now, as a child of the science and technology lobby, born at a time when manufacturing accounted for a much greater share of value added in developed economies than they now do, it's no surprise that the construct of R&D was captured by science and technology. So, for example, quoting almost verbatim from another section of the Frascati manual, there we go. Quoting almost verbatim for another section of the Frascati manual, the guidelines for prospective R&D tax credit claimants issued by the tax authorities in the UK states the following. Your company or organisation can only claim for R&D relief if an R&D project seeks to achieve an advance in overall knowledge or capability in a field of science or technology through the resolution of scientific or technological uncertainty. Science does not include work in the arts, humanities and social sciences. So the Frascati characterization of research and development as composed of first, basic or fundamental research to acquire knowledge without an application in mind, second, applied research where knowledge creation has specific practical aims, and third, experimental development, which draws on research to produce new products, processes and systems, was probably always a simplification of what actually went on in science and technology research. Even so, the clarity of these definitions, has given rise to measurement guidelines and agreed R&D metrics, which have enabled us as economists to explore the relationship between spending on R&D and economic performance at the firm level, and R&D spending and growth at the macroeconomic level, or in other words, to estimate the private and social return on investment in R&D. So a large body of empirical evidence has been gathered which supports the theory that investments in R&D by individual businesses generate positive spillovers on innovation in other firms, which constitutes a market or a systems failure, depending on how you view these things, either way justifying some form of government support for R&D. Now, of course, in practice, the evolution of the R&D construct has been nowhere near as linear as this. I'm sort of simplifying, but I hope you can see where I'm going with the argument. That is that absent definitions of what innovation means in the arts, why it is socially desirable, lacking understandings of investment in innovation, metrics, ways of estimating the return on investment in arts innovation, and the tools to uncover and address market or system failures, is it any surprise that governments have not devoted more money to it? So this was the backdrop to the research collaboration with the Royal National Theatre that David Throsby and I began in 2008, and which we discussed in some length in our Culture of Innovation paper in 2010. We'd noticed that funders in the UK were increasingly speaking about the importance of innovation in the arts. And these two quotes here, from a report commissioned in 2008 by the UK government on supporting excellence in the arts, were typical. Those who fund the arts and those in receipt of funding have a duty to continuously encourage innovation. The boards of cultural organisations, and I include museums and galleries in my understanding of this, are or should be the guardians of innovation and risk-taking. Now, these recommendations were all well and good. The only problem was that no one knew what innovation in this context actually meant. So in Culture of Innovation, our aim was to take a first step in offering an economic framework for innovation that arts and cultural organisations and funders could use to inform their investment decisions. The approach was to suggest a set of definitions based on our reading of the economic literature on not-for-profit organisations, culture economics, and studies of technology adoption in the cultural sector. We then interrogated and refined this framework using in-depth quantitative and qualitative case studies of two of the UK's premier culture institutions, the Royal National Theatre and the Tate. And these organisations gave us an unprecedented access to their audience data as well as to their executive team. And it's probably worth mentioning here, given our earlier discussion about methodology, NESTA is deliberately, we collect an awful lot of data in our work, whether it's through our programmes, through our policy and research, where we collect a lot of primary data in our research, or whether it's through our investments team, where we collect data in the companies that we invest in. We're consciously sort of quite eclectic. So in this presentation here, I'm going to mention quite a lot of survey data that we use, that we collect, experimental research where we're trying to collect observational data through actual sort of practical experiments with organisations, and also a growing interest in big data. And as an aside, if you're interested, we've just recently launched quite an interesting call where we're distributing grants in cooperation with the Kaufman Foundation in the US for researchers that are interested in using random assignment and controlled experiments in understanding innovation. And this is an area where there's very, very little research in the cultural and creative sector. And if there are researchers that are interested, there's quite a lot of money that we've got available in that grant. So I'd encourage you to look at our website. So, notwithstanding the fact that the Tate and the National Theatre were by no means representative of all arts and cultural organisations, we ended up stressing four dimensions of innovation in the arts, which are on this slide. First, innovation in art form development, the development of new work that has at least the potential to influence artistic trends and perhaps lead them in new directions altogether. Second, innovation in audience reach, made up of audience broadening, that is capturing a larger share of the population segment known to be traditional participants, but who currently do not attend. Audience deepening, which is intensifying current participants' level of involvement, measured, for example, by the number of attendances per individual per year, or by the degree of audience engagement with the art form itself. And audience diversifying, that is attracting new groups of audiences who would not otherwise attend. The third dimension of innovation we stressed was innovation in value creation, new ways in which a cultural institution creates value, whether that is mediated in markets or not, in which case they would need to use techniques from public economics or other areas to measure it. And lastly, innovation in business model, changes in financial models or in organisational processes which support new ways of creating value. The most significant element of the research turned out to be the experimental collaboration with the National Theatre in its pilot NT Live, National Theatre Live broadcasts of theatre to digital cinemas. And the results of this work, I'll just briefly touch on it now, but are available in papers in JCE and IJCP. The broadcast was structured with the National Theatre as a piece of what you might think of as being non-scientific and technological experimental development, with the pilot co-designed with the researchers so that we could generate data specifically to test our research questions. And the agreement with the National Theatre, the contractual agreement, was that we would publish the results of the research whatever they showed. So inspired by the Met Opera's live broadcasts of its performances to cinemas since 2006, the National had decided in 2007 that it wanted to experiment with its own live broadcasts. Opera had given it a glimpse of the opportunities. The Met's broadcast had been a global success, we all know, reaching audiences in distant regions who would otherwise have no chance to experience the Met's performances. In 2007, the San Francisco Opera had followed suit. By the time of the National's first live broadcast of Nick Heitner's production of Ted Hughes' translation of Racine's play Phèdre in June 2009, the Royal Opera House in London had also started live screenings. Now, in theatre, while of course audio-visual recordings of production, as you all know, had been available for some time in the form of DVDs or TV broadcasts, and there had been a few experiments of live broadcasts of stage productions to TV, no theatre had yet explored HD broadcast to cinemas. So as a consequence, it was not at all clear to the management of the National Theatre what audience appetite would be for the broadcasts, whether they would appeal to seasoned theatre goers or be a draw for less experienced theatre goers. How well would the broadcasts preserve the excitement and intimacy which are the hallmark of live theatre? Might the broadcasts be so successful that they might actually cannibalise attendances at the theatre? Or rather, would they devalue the art form in the eyes of theatre professionals and the public, which was a significant risk according to the National Theatre's executives? How much would audiences be willing to pay for the experience? And could there be a self-sustaining business model? And on a more prosaic level, how well would the technology work? Would the HD broadcast preserve the quality of the live experience for audiences? So these were all uncertainties that presented barriers to innovation and which perhaps might have been insurmountable had the live screenings not been piloted as a piece of R&D, where the whole point was to take risks and answer these questions. In the event, Phèdre was seen live on 73 digital cinema screens at 70 unique sites in the UK and was relayed to a further 210 sites in the rest of the world. A total of 14,000 across the UK saw that evening's production. A further 14,000 people saw it live across Europe or on the same day in North America, if you allow for time zone differences. And including those cinema audiences in other countries who saw the production at a later date, Australia, other countries, it is estimated that more than 50,000 people saw Phèdre as it was performed on the 25th of June 2009. So the National Theatre live broadcasts had allowed the theatre clearly to expand its virtual capacity, and to put the numbers into context, the audience for Phèdre over its whole 3-month run at the theatre was doubled through the screening of that single performance. According to our audience surveys, almost half of the cinema goers on that night said that the main reason why they had not seen Phèdre at the theatre was because the National Theatre's location was too far away, or because they'd been unable to get theatre tickets. It'd been a sellout performance. And while the great majority of the theatre audience had been to the National Theatre in the previous 12 months, this was only the case for just over 40% of audiences who saw Phèdre at the cinema. The National Theatre had reached only a small number, both in absolute and relative terms, of theatre novices through the broadcast, however. Less than 10% had not been to the theatre at all in the previous year, suggesting, in this case at least, that drawing in complete newcomers to theatre is not simply a question of distribution technology. Perhaps NT Live's most striking extension in audience reach was a broadening of low-income audiences. 1/3 of cinema audiences had incomes of lower than £20,000 a year, compared with just over 1/5 in the case of theatre. And the potential of digital technology to help overcome the traditionally observed concentration of theatre audiences amongst relatively affluent consumers seems to be corroborated by this experiment. One of the most significant findings from this research was how National Theatre Live appeared to complement, not substitute, for the theatre in the eyes of the public. Over 1/3 of cinema audiences said that having seen the live screening of Phèdre, it was now more likely that they would attend a live performance at the National Theatre itself. However, and given our discussion earlier, quite lengthy discussion about stated preferences and potential biases in surveys, we know that survey findings can give biased, imperfect indicators of audiences' future intentions. So to address this, we worked at the beginning of the project with the National Theatre on a quasi-field experiment dimension to the broadcast, just to see if we could triangulate the survey findings. And the issue here, the practical question here, was whether we could agree with the National Theatre if there were enough participating cinemas in the commuter belt of the National South Bank location, and if we can get access to detailed information on the postcodes of theatre bookers to Phèdre, and for similar productions as controls, could we test whether districts in the catchment area of participating cinemas were over or underrepresented at the National Theatre's box office compared with districts with no cinemas? And this is a bit of a practical challenge, because the whole point about this project from the National Theatre's point of view was to bring in audiences that would not otherwise have an opportunity to go to the National Theatre. So they were aiming for cinema screens far away from London. But a condition of the funding was that it needed to include enough cinemas in the commuter belt so that we could exploit this sort of quasi-field experiment quality. And of course it's a quasi-field experiment because I didn't ask the National Theatre to randomly select which cinemas participated, although I'd have liked to have done that. So what we found in the event, that there were, if anything, significantly greater numbers of theatre goers, on average over 50% more, from the catchment areas of participating cinemas. So no evidence of cannibalisation. It seems, for that production at least, of Phaedra on the 25th of June 2009, as well as growing the audience through cinema audiences, the National Theatre had grown audiences at the National Theatre itself. Now, as well as allowing us to establish the extent to which the National Theatre reached less traditional audiences for its work, through our surveys we also studied whether the live broadcast had created new or unexpected experiences for audiences. Were there new forms of cultural value created, for example, going back to the third dimension of innovation that I mentioned earlier, which were different from those generated by theatre in its traditional mode of production? What we found was counterintuitive. Quite a lot is known about the emotional and aesthetic value that audiences derive from live theatre. There's a good deal of research on that. So we weren't surprised to find that the proportion of the cinema audience expecting to have an emotional or uplifting experience was significantly smaller than for the theatre audience. But what we were surprised to find was that in the event, the actual experience was much more emotionally engaging and aesthetically pleasing for cinema audiences than theatre audiences. And this result generated a good deal of debate at the time, so we gave it its own name, Beyond Live. Now, we took these different aspects of the production's cultural value for audiences and estimated simple econometric models to explore the relationship with their economic valuations as measured by willingness to pay. And the results indicated that elements of cultural value most clearly associated with consumers' economic valuations of their experiences were the aesthetic or symbolic value indicated by their emotional response and the social value of the group experience. So taken at face value, these results suggested that far from devaluing the art form in the eyes of consumers, the National had, through its live broadcasts, created a novel experience, a novel cultural experience, live theatre at your local cinema, which had its own artistic merits. Now, since we completed this research, the National Theatre live screenings have gone from strength to strength. You'll probably, many of you, I don't know if any of you, have any of you been to an NT live screening? I'm not sure if you get any in Spain, but with 260 cinemas regularly participating in the UK, British audiences alone for the screenings exceed 50,000, which you'll remember was the global figure for the first production. So in 4 years, it really has been an exponential rise. There's a further 350 screens now participating in 25 countries, with cumulative audiences reaching 1.3 million. The theatre even interestingly runs out what it calls encore streaming performances, which further challenge traditional notions of what is meant by live. So I think this year we're in the 4th year of a live screening of Frankenstein, Danny Boyle's production of Frankenstein, and it's still selling out, which again, you know, it would be a wonderful research opportunity to try and collect some more data from audiences on how they perceive this experience as live, given that it clearly isn't. So to summarise, the screenings have allowed the National Theatre in its latest annual report to announce its highest ever income figures. These are over double than 10 years ago. And this is at a time, remember, when the UK has a fiscal crisis, meaning that public subsidies for arts organisations are being slashed everywhere, including the National Theatre. The reaction of the public to the National Theatre's live screening has been so great that there's even a suggestion that it may have inspired audiences to go to other theatres. Certainly in our audience surveys for Phaedra, the pilot production, significant numbers of people said that they were more likely to attend their local theatre having experienced the live screenings. Estimating or establishing whether this is actually being the case is the focus of new research we're conducting using big data. It's a shame that this presentation wasn't given even in a month or so's time. I can give you some results from that, but just to explain what we're doing, what the nature of the data is. What we've got here is daily box office data for about 7 years from a very large number of theatre venues across England. And what we're doing is we're exploring whether individuals living closer to the National Theatre live screening venues have become, over time, more frequent visitors to their local theatres or less compared with those living further away. So is it the case that controlling for the usual socio-demographic indicators for theatre attendance, we've matched this data, this box office data, with socio-demographic data at a very, very local level. We're testing to see whether proximity, is it the case if you're living next door to one of these live screening venues, other things being equal, are you more likely or less likely to go to the theatre, the local theatre? So as I said, hopefully in the next month or two we'll be able to present some first results. So the positive reaction to the National Theatre's live screenings that I've just described in some detail has not just been restricted to audiences, as we now know from this research that we began last year. It's been shared by the rest of the sector too, by other arts and culture organisations too. In our digital culture paper, which we published in November, and again you can download from our website, we reported the first findings of a 3-year longitudinal study of how arts and culture organisations in England are using digital technologies. We found that live streaming was the fastest area of technology adoption. There are a number of questions in the survey. It's a fairly detailed survey asking about various sort of fairly granular questions about how arts and culture organisations are engaging with technology. Quite a problematic survey to devise, but I think we've been fairly successful in putting together a good survey instrument. And what you find is that of all the various different technologies we ask about, live streaming across the piece, so this is a survey of a variety of different types of arts and culture organisations, that number has doubled in the past 12 months alone. Still only 15%, so 15% of culture institutions are engaging in live streaming of performances, but that number has doubled in 12 months alone. And some fairly intuitive variations across types of art and culture organisation as well, whether it's a museum live streaming an interview, for example, with a curator of an exhibition, or whether it's a performing arts organisation that's doing live broadcasts like the National Theatre is doing. And also some intuitive differences between small and large organisations, which appear to sort of give some confidence in the data. So let me just go on to talk finally now about this intervention, the Digital R&D Fund for the Arts. I mentioned that NESTA can be thought of as an experimental development agency. A fair bit of my work, because I'm quite interested in experimental methods, so a fair bit of my work is really working with the programs team to design programs from a research-led perspective, where the goal of the program really isn't really to support businesses, it's more to create knowledge, which if we publish widely and publish the data widely, we can hope to support innovation that way. So the Digital R&D Fund for the Arts is a good example of this. That National Theatre Live research, one of the reasons I explained it in some detail, even though it's a couple of years out of date now, is that it really politically created a head of steam behind the idea for this fund. Essentially, this was, the project with the National Theatre happened opportunistically. The National Theatre had approached NESTA for a grant, I guess assuming that we were like a National Endowment for Arts, and our response was we'd give you a grant, but only if you configure the grant, the project as a piece of research and development. So we agreed some clear research questions with the National Theatre, we cleared a data strategy, and we held them to that as time went on. But the problem was that was done opportunistically. There didn't appear to be a systematic source of funding for organisations that wanted to engage in this sort of research. So we established this Digital R&D Fund for the Arts in partnership with the Arts Council England, which you can think of, I suppose, as being the UK sort of equivalent of the National Endowment for Arts. I mean, it's a very different institution, but it distributes public funds to arts and cultural organisations. And the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is the main research, as the name suggests, the research funder in England and the rest of the UK for arts and humanities research. So it was a three-way partnership, and the idea was to support experimentation, research-led experimentation with digital technologies in the arts and culture sector. Between 2012 and the middle of this year, the fund will have awarded £7 million to projects that use digital technology to enhance audience reach and or develop new business models for the arts and culture sector. So the idea is maybe if we could have, say, 50 projects, say in 2 years' time we'll be looking back, 50 projects of the scale of National Theatre Live. The hope is that the research and the evidence base that's been created by that will add up to a significant boost to how arts and culture organisations productively use technology in the UK and beyond. So the R&D projects involve three-way collaborations, as this slide suggests, between arts and culture organisations, technology companies and researchers. We designed the fund this way deliberately to enable the pollination of ideas across different disciplines, to encourage, importantly, the development of new networks. In one way or the other, a lot of what NESTA does really is about convening networks of innovators who might not otherwise come together, to build arts R&D capacity more generally, and to ensure that the lessons, this is critical, from the R&D are captured and understood by the participating organisations. So all the contractual relationships, just like the National Theatre Live, are predicated on the idea that the data will be published regardless